Welcome to this deep dive from IrishArchaeology.org. Today we're focusing on, well, a really pivotal time in Ireland's past. We're looking at the earlier Mesolithic period that's roughly 8,000 down to about 6,700 BC.
That's right, and it's so significant because this is when we see the first continuous human settlement in Ireland after the Ice Age. A real shift from any fleeting presence before that.
Continuous being the key word there.
Exactly. It's really the beginning of the story of people living here uninterrupted. And what defines it archaeologically, primarily, is this fascinating microlithic stone tool technology.
Tiny tools, big impact.
Precisely, and it shows how resourceful these early people were adapting to what was, frankly, a dramatically changing environment.
And what an environment. You have to try and picture Ireland just emerging from the grip of the last glaciation.
Everything's in flux. The climate's warming up rapidly, new ecosystems are developing, woodlands starting to spread across a landscape that was previously tundra.
So these first settlers, they weren't just stepping onto new land. They were stepping into a world that was actively being created, in a way.
Actively evolving, yes. They were navigating this raw, dynamic landscape. Their success really underlines an incredible adaptability.
Now, something crucial to understand right from the start is that Ireland was already an island long before these people arrived.
Absolutely critical point. By about 14,000 BC, maybe even earlier, the land bridges were gone. Ireland was definitively separate.
So their arrival around 8,000 BC wasn't just a walk in the park. It had to be a deliberate sea crossing.
It's a maritime achievement, pure and simple. Their presence here is proof of seafaring capability.
Which implies, some pretty sophisticated understanding for the time, not just drifting accidentally.
No, highly unlikely to be accidental colonization on any significant scale. It suggests planning, knowledge, and capable watercraft.
What kind of boats were we talking about? Do we have any direct evidence?
Direct evidence from this early. That's the challenge. It's incredibly rare. But we can make educated guesses based on later finds and technology elsewhere in Europe. Log boats, dug out from large tree trunks, are a strong possibility. Simple, but effective.
Okay.
Or perhaps more complex, skin-covered frames. Think light wooden structures with animal hides stretched over them.
A bit like early carracks or kayaks?
Sort of, yes, that kind of technology. And we do have later Mesolithic evidence, like a logboat found near Lough Neagh dating to around 5300 BC. So the know-how was definitely here later on.
Right, so it pushes the probability of earlier versions back.
Exactly. Plus, we find Mesolithic material on islands like Innistrahul off the Donegal coast.
You definitely need a boat to get there.
You absolutely do. It's clear evidence they weren't just hugging the coastline. They had genuine maritime skills. This points towards deliberate exploration, maybe expansion, by groups who already had these traditions.
Where would they have come from?
The strongest candidate is Britain, specifically areas like Scotland, maybe Wales, southwest England, places relatively close across the Irish Sea.
So probably not one big arrival, but maybe smaller groups over time.
That seems most plausible. A series of smaller migrations, perhaps from different points in Britain, spread out over generations. It fits the archaeological pattern and also aligns with the genetic picture that's emerging.
Ah, yes, the genetics. Ancient DNA has been revolutionary here, hasn't it? What does it tell us about these first people?
It's fascinating. ADNA shows they were closely related to other contemporary hunter-gatherers in Britain. Cheddarman is the famous example, and also across Northwest Europe. They're part of that Western hunter-gatherer genetic cluster. But what's really striking is a reconstruction of their physical appearance. The genetics suggest they likely had very dark, possibly black skin, but combined with blue or green eyes and dark hair.
That's quite different from the typical image of Irish people today.
Completely different. It's thought to be the ancestral European look for that period. The genes for lighter skin came in much, much later with the arrival of farmers in the Neolithic.
It really paints a different picture of the past.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Ireland's isolation. How did being an island shape the actual environment they found?
Well, being cut off by the sea acted as sort of ecological filter. Not all the plants and animals that recolonized Britain after the Ice Age managed to make the crossing to Ireland naturally.
So a less diverse ecosystem.
Comparatively, yes. Especially in terms of large mammals, they arrived to find an Ireland with a somewhat impoverished native fauna compared to Britain or the continent. No elk, no aurochs, crucially, no red deer.
No red deer. That must have been a huge factor in their survival strategy. Red deer were staple food elsewhere, weren't they?
Absolutely. A major food source for Mesolithic groups across Europe. Their absence here forced the Irish settlers to adapt, to rely much more heavily on other resources like wild boar, fish, birds, and plants. It fundamentally shaped their way of life.
And the land itself wasn't static either. You mentioned the coastline changing.
That's right. You had two major forces at play. Global sea levels were rising as the ice sheets melted.
Okay.
But at the same time, the land mass of Ireland, freed from the enormous weight of the ice, was slowly rising too. That's isostatic rebound.
So a complex interaction.
Very complex. The net effect varied regionally, but generally sea levels rose relative to the land, especially in the earlier part of the Mesolithic. This means many of the very first coastal areas they would have lived on are now underwater.
Which makes finding those earliest sites incredibly difficult.
Exactly. Particularly in the southwest, former shorelines might be tens of meters below current sea level. It's a major challenge for archaeology.
So a dynamic, world-warming climate, rising seas, spreading forests, unique animal life. How did these hunter-gatherer fishers actually live day to day?
They were highly mobile, moving across the landscape to follow resources. Their settlements cluster near water coasts, estuaries, rivers, lakes. Makes sense, right? Water provides food, resources, and it's also a highway for travel.
Transport routes, yeah.
And we see evidence of what archaeologists call persistent places. Favored spots they return to again and again, maybe seasonally, maybe over generations. It shows they knew the landscape intimately.
Did they build shelters? What did their homes look like?
Our best evidence comes from Mount Sandal up in County Derry. Excavations there uncovered patterns of post holes. These suggest they built circular or maybe oval huts around 6 meters across, probably made from bent saplings, forming a kind of frame, which would then have been covered with something perishable, hides, reeds, turf, that kind of thing.
Simple but effective shelters.
Yes. And importantly, they often had central hearths inside. For warmth, cooking, light the heart of the home, even then, these Mount Sandal structures are really our type site for Mesolithic dwellings in Ireland.
And what about how they organized themselves? Small family groups.
That's the most likely scenario, based on comparisons with other hunter-gatherer groups and the likely carrying capacity of the land. Small, mobile bands, probably based on extended families.
Fairly egalitarian, perhaps.
Yeah. Generally, yes, that tends to be the pattern in such societies. Though successfully colonizing a new land and managing resources probably required strong cooperation, shared knowledge passed down, maybe some informal leadership roles emerging when needed.
Makes sense. Let's talk subsistence. You mentioned no red deer, so what were they eating?
They had to be flexible, a broad-spectrum diet. Hunting focused heavily on wild boar in the woodlands. That was their main large mammal.
Right.
But they also took smaller game hare, maybe fox, badger, even wildcat. Birds were important too, waterfowl, pigeons, grouse, seabirds near the coast.
And fishing must have been key, given the focus on water sources.
Absolutely crucial. Rivers and lakes were teeming with salmon, trout, eels. Coastal waters had sea bass, flounder, and so on. We don't have many early Mesolithic fishing tools preserved, but later finds, like complex fish traps, suggest they had sophisticated techniques right from the start. They must have.
Like the Clownstown trap.
Exactly, though that's later Mesolithic. But it shows the kind of knowledge that was likely developing. And then there's gathering.
Plant foods.
Yes, very important. Hazelnuts are everywhere in the archaeological record because the charred shells preserve really well. They seem to have been a major staple food, especially in autumn.
A reliable source of fat and protein.
Definitely. And they'd have gathered other fruits, berries, seeds, edible roots as they became available. On the coast, shellfish, oysters, limpets, mussels were easy pickings. Later on, the discarded shells build up into middens, which are treasure troves for archaeologists.
So it sounds like their whole year was structured around moving to where the food was.
Absolutely. A seasonal round, exploiting different resources at different times. Mount Sandal, for instance, shows evidence for summer salmon fishing, autumn hazelnut gathering, maybe winter boar hunting.
And the rivers and lakes weren't just for fishing. They were the main routes for getting around.
Yes, the main corridors for travel, connecting different resource zones across the landscape. Essential for that mobile lifestyle.
We touched on it earlier, but that burial site at Hermitage sounds incredibly significant. Can you tell us more?
It really is remarkable. Hermitage, down in County Limerick, on the banks of the Shannon, we have a cremation burial there, dated to around 7,500, 7,300 BC. That makes it the oldest known human burial in Ireland.
Wow, the earliest.
The cremated remains were of an adult, placed in a pit. And intriguingly, there was a post hole found nearby which might, just might, have held some kind of grave marker.
And the grave goods.
This is the extraordinary part. Placed with the remains was a beautifully made, highly polished adze crafted from shale. But it wasn't intact. It shows definite signs of having been deliberately blunted or damaged, ritually killed, as archaeologists sometimes say.
Ritually killed. What does that imply?
Well, it suggests complex beliefs about death, the afterlife, maybe spirits, taking an object out of the world of the living, sending it with the deceased. It points to symbolic behavior, ritual practice, way beyond just basic survival.
That level of craftsmanship and then the ritual act. It speaks volumes about their inner world, even so early on.
It really does. The effort involved in making that polished adze in the first place, and then the deliberate act of modifying it for burial. It's profound evidence for a sophisticated worldview.
Let's shift focus to the toolkit itself, those microliths that define the period. What exactly are they?
Okay, so microliths are, as the name suggests, small stone tools, usually made from flint, typically less than 5 centimeters long, often much smaller.
Tiny.
Yes. And they're not just simple flakes. They are sections of small blades that have been deliberately snapped and then carefully shaped by retouching, chipping away tiny flakes into specific geometric forms.
What kind of shapes?
In the Irish Earlier Mesolithic, we see characteristic types like scalene triangles, narrow rods, little pointed tools called needle points, which might be a local Irish development, and backed blades where one edge is blunted for hafting.
Hafting, so they weren't used on their own.
Almost never. That's the key thing to understand. These tiny pieces were designed as components, like replaceable parts, for composite tools. They'd be set into slots or grooves in handles or shafts made of wood, bone, or antler.
Ah, I see.
They'd be fixed in place using adhesives, natural glues, like pine resin or birch bark tar. So imagine them forming the sharp barbs on a spear or harpoon, or the cutting edge of a knife made of multiple small blades set in a row.
A very clever way to make the most of good quality stone, especially if it wasn't common everywhere.
Exactly. Flint was the preferred material because it fractures predictably, giving you sharp edges. But the best sources are mainly in the Northeast County Antrim chalk, the gravels at the Curran near Larne.
So what did they do elsewhere?
They adapted. Where flint was scarce, like in the Midlands, they used chert, which you find in limestone areas. The Loughborough site is a good example of a chert-based toolkit.
Right.
And out west, where even chert might be uncommon, they made do with other fine-grained stones like siltstone or mudstone. They were pragmatic. They used what was available.
And making these tiny, precise shapes must have been quite fiddly work.
It required real skill and control. First, you need to produce small, thin blades from a core. This was likely done using direct percussion, but with a soft hammer, something like antler or dense wood rather than a hard stone hammer, to allow for more delicate flaking.
Okay.
Then those blades were segmented, often using what's called the microburn technique. You make a small notch, then snap the blade cleanly at that point. It's efficient and leaves a characteristic waste flake, the microburn itself, which helps us identify the process.
And then the final shaping.
Final shaping was done by retouching, carefully pressing off tiny flakes to create the desired geometric form and sharp edges or blunted backs for hafting. Then, as we said, mounting them into the organic handle or shaft.
A multi-stage, quite complex process.
Definitely. It produced a versatile toolkit, though. Arrow tips, spear barbs, harpoon components for hunting and fishing, small cutting tools for various daily tasks. At Mount Sandal, they even found some larger flakes, butt-trimmed flakes, that might have been used for spearing fish like eels or flounder.
Very adaptable. Now, you mentioned the polished adze from Hermitage. Finding polished stone tools in this period is a bit unusual, isn't it? Usually we associate that with the Neolithic, with farming.
It is somewhat unusual, yes. While polished stone axes and adzes become much more common in the Neolithic, we do find them here in the Irish Earlier Mesolithic, maybe even more frequently than in contemporary Britain, which is interesting.
So examples like at Mount Sandal and Loughborough, alongside Hermitage.
That's right. And that Hermitage adze, made of shale and fully polished, dating back possibly as early as 7500 BC. It really is remarkable. It could be one of the earliest examples of a completely polished stone tool in all of Europe.
That's quite a claim. Making them must have been incredibly time-consuming.
Hugely laborious. You'd shape the basic form by flaking and pecking, then hours and hours of grinding and polishing against abrasive stones, probably using sand and water, to get that smooth finish and sharp edge.
What were they used for? Woodworking seems obvious.
Woodworking is the most likely primary function, yes. Felling smaller trees, shaping wood for shelters, tools, maybe log boats. Some have suggested they could also be used for digging.
But the Hermitage one suggests more than just function.
Absolutely. The context of the burial, the ritual killing it, elevates these objects beyond simple tools. They clearly held significant symbolic weight, representing perhaps status, spiritual power, or community identity.
So these key sites, Mount Sandal, Loch Bora, Hermitage, they each give us a different piece of the puzzle.
Precisely. Mount Sandal, early houses, diet, seasonal life, the toolkit. Loch Bora, inland adaptation using different raw materials like chert, maybe ritual hints with bird bones. Hermitage,
Yeah.
your earliest burial, complex ritual, incredible craftsmanship.
And other places add more detail.
Yes, places like the Curran show us where they got their flint and worked it on a large scale. Sites like Balmaglaff in County Down reveal extensive scatters, indicating popular revisited locations. Inishtrahul confirms their seafaring. Even the much older Paleolithic find from Alice and Gwendolyn Cave, that bare bone with cut marks, provides context for human presence on the island, even if it wasn't continuous then.
It builds a rich picture. And coming back to the people themselves, the genetics confirming the dark skin-line eyes combination is just striking.
It really challenges our preconceptions, doesn't it? It highlights how much populations have changed over millennia. And the genetic evidence also points to a degree of isolation in Ireland.
More isolated than Britain at the same time.
The data suggests possibly yes. Ireland's separation by sea was perhaps earlier and more definitive. This, combined with what were likely small founding populations arriving, could have led to greater genetic drift, random changes in gene frequencies over time. It might have subtly influenced not just their genetic makeup, but potentially aspects of their cultural trajectory too.
So, pulling it all together, what's the lasting impression of these earlier Mesolithic people?
I think it's one of incredible resilience and ingenuity. These were true pioneers. They made deliberate sea voyages to reach Ireland. They learned to thrive in a unique, evolving, post-glacial environment without some key resources found elsewhere.
They developed a sophisticated toolkit tailored to that environment.
Exactly. They exploited rivers, lakes, coasts, and woodlands effectively. And right from the very beginning, as Hermitage shows, they had complex social lives, rituals, and symbolic understanding. They laid the absolute foundations for all subsequent human history on this island.
And the research continues. Presumably, there's still more to learn.
Oh, absolutely. There's huge potential in exploring submerged landscapes for those lost coastal sites. More ancient DNA analysis will refine the picture of population origins and movements. Detailed use-where studies on the tools can tell us exactly how they were used.
Finding new sites, too.
Always, especially looking inland, in uplands, places perhaps less investigated before. Understanding their watercraft better is another goal. And continuing to piece together the puzzle of their social organization and belief systems. It's an ongoing story.
It really makes you think about their connection to the world around them, a world changing so rapidly. Their adaptability in the face of that environmental upheaval. Perhaps there are lessons or perspectives there for us today in our own changing world.
It's certainly a provocative thought. Their deep reliance on and intimate knowledge of their environment was fundamental to their survival and success.
A fascinating journey back to the very dawn of continuous life in Ireland. Thank you for guiding us through it.